Orbis. The current issue of Orbis, which we started to plan last year, centered around the theme of Russia's long shadow over Europe. We had no idea that that shadow would be materialized as of yesterday in Ukraine with military action, a major combined arms campaign, the resumption of warfare in Europe on a scale not seen in decades, really calling into question many of the pillars of the post-Cold War era. And what we have today for you are two eminent experts and scholars and scholar practitioners who have been dealing with questions of Russia, Ukraine, European security, the transatlantic relationship, because of what's been happening over the last 24 hours. Certainly, many of our assumptions about how the world operates are now being questioned, and we are entering really into a new era and unknown territory, unknown ground. Rather than trying to comment on the days of the news and trying to get a sense of what's happening hour to hour, I think our two speakers are going to take the events of today based on what they wrote for Orbis and try to get us a sense of how we're going to navigate this new territory, this unknown country, really where the assumptions we've been operating with over the last 30 years are now being set by the wayside. We have two, as I mentioned, two very critical thinkers and longstanding experts on the region, also happen to be friends of mine. So it's a real pleasure to welcome both Doctors Valbona Zanelli and Andreas Umland virtually to this seminar, and welcoming you all to this event at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which fits very much within our overall mission of trying to give you, the audience, the tools you need to understand and interpret the events of the day. In the invitation, you got links to their articles, and they're being reposted in the chat as they have appeared in Orbis. Just briefly, full biographies went out for both of them, but just to remind you that Dr. Zanelli is a professor and chair of strategic initiatives at the Marshall Center, which is a joint installation of the United States and of Germany for educating people, and particularly military officers who are charged with helping to ensure the security of the Euro-Atlantic area. And unfortunately, just as at the Naval War College, so with the Marshall Center, some of the alumni of our programs are this very day being called on to exercise those duties of protection of their homelands. And then to my other colleague and friend, Andreas Umland, who has been resident in Kiev, I believe, for 20 years, although fortunately, or perhaps not fortunately, is not in Kiev at the exact moment, but has been there, has really watched many of these trends that we're seeing today in 22 begin to unfold, both in terms of Ukraine's push for joining the Euro-Atlantic community, but also many of these negative trends that we have observed in Russia. He has been chronicling and charting all of this for many years. He does it from two perches. One, as an academic and part of the famed Kiev Mohyla Academy, which was recreated, the historic institution of learning in Ukraine, which was recreated after the fall of the Soviet Union. And also, and I'm sorry, just pull this, at the Stockholm Center for East European Studies. And I believe you're in Stockholm right now, where I'm sure they had brought you in for consultations, given the crisis. But you're speaking to us from Stockholm. And I might add that Dr. Zanelli is speaking to us from the sidelines of a NATO conference in the Netherlands, where again, questions about transatlantic security have shifted from being academic questions to now becoming policy questions. With that, Dr. Zanelli, if I can turn to you first for your opening thoughts. Dr. Umland will come to you afterwards. For all of our audience members, we have enabled the question and answer function in the Zoom, which allows you to post your questions, and we'll be taking questions and comments from that question and answer site on Zoom. So, Dr. Zanelli, Val, if I can turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you for this invitation. And I want to apologize, first of all, because this is not the most perfect setting, but I'm on the road. As Nick explained, I was part of the NATO's conference that was organized by the government of Germany and the government of the Netherlands, focusing specifically on partnerships. So the conference was held yesterday in The Hague, and I'm traveling today. So I want to apologize again for the setting. Let me start with this. We really, not just me that, has very, great affinity and great friends in Ukraine. I think, we're all woke up saddened and devastated and heartbroken today, not only because of our friends, as I mentioned, but because I think what happened yesterday is going to change the history of Europe, is going to change the history of the world. This was a blatant attack on a sovereign country. This is an invasion. This is a strong violation of international norms and law. So I could go on, but this was is devastating for us all. Unfortunately, based on conversations with, with our friends and colleagues in Ukraine, for a very long time, they knew that this was not about if it's going to happen, but it was mainly when it was going to happen, because everything started, in 2014. And not just in 2014, I could go back and say that everything started in 2008. Well, I think, President Putin has something with numbers, because in 2008 was 8/8 2008, and now is 22/2022. Before I continue, also I forgot to mention that I work for the Marshall Center, but here I represent my own thoughts as a scholar, so I do not represent the opinion of the Marshall Center or the German or the U.S. governments. So 3 important reasons. First, why did this happen? And we're all expecting, there were, different scenarios. I think everybody was wishing for the most, less violent scenario. But as we're seeing, it's a blatant attack throughout, across Ukraine. The first thing is that Ukraine is important for Putin. And if we didn't know much about that, it was made very clear in his speech, in his article that he wrote back in July 2021, when he specifically, although he made a very long, history of explaining why Ukraine is important for the new empire, for the Ruski Mir, based on the cultural, religious and, people-to-people ties. But also he was very explicit there, saying that there's no Ukrainian sovereignty out of the relations with Russia. So that was, simple and plain. And the second point that he mentioned there was that the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Belarusians are one people. That was the second message. And this is what we're seeing. So the first, as I mentioned, is important. Ukraine is important, not just, historically, in terms of economically, is also very important. We should not forget that back in 2013 also, when the former President Yanukovych decided not to sign the stabilization agreement with the European Union under strong pressure from Russia, was because Russia had, established the Eurasian Economic Union. And that union does not exist without Ukraine, because 40% of the union is this strong, would have been the economy of Ukraine. So the union, although it was sold as something, very important and that will be very competitive in the global economy, which right now only makes up 4% of the global GDP, did not exist without Ukraine. So we should not also forget the economic perspective, also in economic terms, how important Ukraine is for Putin. And the second most important thing is that Putin cannot allow a Ukraine that is a free market economy, a free democratic country in a liberal system, because that will mean that other former Soviet Union countries will follow suit. And that is unacceptable for Putin. So if there's this big, the biggest objective why this was the choice of the Ukrainians to look, to the West, the choice of the Ukrainians to aim for Euro-Atlantic integration, both EU and NATO integration, I think that was the biggest danger for Putin. The second point is the regional perspective. And so we have all the region that we have frozen conflicts. We have Moldova, we have Transnistria, and then in 2008, we have Georgia, Ukraine, now since 2014. So that is the best way through the frozen conflicts to really disrupt the Euro-Atlantic integration process of the region. So making these countries, fail, like this is the aim for Ukraine also now, kind of to put Ukraine on its knees, and so that the government there will fail, and then it will be followed by a government that is a proxy government to the Russians. And the region is very important, not only in geopolitical, but also in economic and energy terms for Russia. The other thing is also then the third thing is the transatlantic, relations and the European relations. I think Putin's main objective is really to divide the West. First, to divide the transatlantic community, and second, within the European Union, we have already seen attempts that have started not now, it have started years ago, also through massive disinformation campaign, through using energy as a strong tool of leverage for Russia, really creating these divisions inside the European Union. I'm afraid that in the future we'll see if the conflict will continue for a long time, is that there's going to be another tool that will be used to divide the European Union, and that will be the migration, because we're going to have a migration crisis in Europe. That right now we have a strong unity in the European Union, and this is the good news. I think this is the unintended consequence of Putin's behavior over the last few months. Like it was in 2014, I think the unintended consequence was the unity of Ukrainians and the getting them together to create the Ukrainian national identity. And we'll see it develop stronger, I would say, in the next months and years to come. And so we have seen this unity from the European Union. The second package of the sanctions was pushed out today. Now there are both opinions. There are optimists, and there's also skepticism. Some say that the sanctions are not enough, and we can argue about that. Maybe we have to be stronger, because I think that for the transatlantic community to respond to Putin, unity is the best deterrence against his plans. And maybe very quickly, I will move also, Nick explained the article that we wrote together with former Deputy Assistant Secretary Mike Ryan in more looking at the transatlantic community. I think there is time now, and this is also what I talked about yesterday at the conference on the partnerships. I think that all recent events are driving home the reality that strategic competition today, or the great power competition, strategic competition, is centering more and more on forms of governance. And I think, this is where we are confronted with this bipolar perspective between democracy and autocracy. And we are at, an age of disruption. Elements, what happened today showed that, we are at an inflection point. Which direction we will take depends on our actions. Unfortunately, for the last 10 years, we have seen a huge rise in autocracy throughout the world. Unfortunately, autocrats are selling it sometimes even as efficient. And unfortunately, many countries and populations in many countries are even starting to buy this narrative. So perhaps Now it's time for the West, now at this, inflection point, then we should go back to basics. Things that, we discussed 70 years ago, 50 years ago. What is democracy about? What are strong institutions about? Why democracy, although it is messy, and we know that all, is much better than autocracy, because this is the new dilemma, I would say now, not just in Europe, but throughout the world. And so our competitive advantage are our democratic values, because they have created our way of life and our economic prosperity. So if we have to ask the question, why? Why do we have to react to what Putin is doing also today? We have to protect our way of life. But our way of life, our prosperity, our democracy was built on the foundation 70 years ago, on this architecture of security of Europe. And I don't want to continue longer. So 3 points that I'll very happily then discuss also in the Q&A. What we need to do as a community of democracies, as a transatlantic community, but also NATO, will be demonstrate resilience, demonstrate unity, and also autonomy. Very quickly, when I talk about resilience, we need to take a comprehensive approach to resilience, from physical resilience to economic resilience to societal resilience, and also resilience of democratic processes. And this is the way also of working with our partners. This is what we have to push more. This is what we should have done even better in the past, working with partners of NATO, with Ukraine, with Georgia, and others in the Balkans. The second point is unity of purpose and effort. And this is where we have to show it now. This is the time that we have to show this unity, because the idea is how to include more countries into the core of the free market democracies in order to make them eventually net contributors to prosperity and security. And then the third point is that we have to really actively practice our collective autonomy as a transatlantic community across the global commons. We have to start talking more about this, from freedom of the seas to space, within the information environment, cybersecurity, climate change, and others. And I'm going to stop here, not to take time from our discussion, and be happy to answer your questions. I hope this was not very disruptive and you could hear me well.
I can hear you well.
Thank you.
Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Nick. Valboda has already said many things that I would have also said, so maybe I can delve into some sort of comparative and historical issues here that brought us to this. I was asked today, how one could explain by journalists this strange behavior of Putin. And, especially being a German, this is not actually that strange. This is a behavior of a post-imperial or neo-imperial leadership. And we've observed that before in world history. I don't think, by the way, Putin is a Russian Hitler. With a colleague, we have compared Putin in terms of his biography and his sort of coming to power in Russia. Rather, if we take the German comparison to a man called Paul von Hindenburg, who was an old representative of the Second German Empire, who became the imperial president in the late 1920s, and then actually made Hitler a chancellor. Putin is no Hitler, but Putin is a somewhat typical post-imperial, neo-imperial politician in this sort of situation that we have in the post-Soviet space. And the behavior that he is now showing is also not something that specific to the post-imperial, post-Soviet space. So when he now, for instance, is calling for a denazification of Ukraine, that reminds me of the, I think I'm mentioning this in the article that was published in Orbis, about the justification for Russia's involvement in an inner Moldovan conflict, almost exactly 30 years ago, when the then commander of the 14th Russian Army in Moldova justified the intrusion of this Russian army into an inner Moldovan conflict with his observation that the new leadership in Chisinau, in the new Republic of Moldova that had just emerged out of the Soviet Union, is worse than the SS. That was his justification, and if that is true, then of course we should all welcome a Russian army going in there and solving this. And since then, of course, this sort of discourse has been repeated many times with regard to the Baltic countries. In Georgia, the major term was genocide that was used, that is now also used with regard to the invasion of Ukraine. And the whole fascism issue, of course, has been playing a lot, this rhetoric, a large role in the Russian propaganda since 2014, if not before. In a way, the surprise of what we're just now observing in Ukraine could be put actually in different ways. Why is it only happening, or why did it only start in 2014 and not early on, as in Georgia, as in Moldova? And we had, of course, in many of the successor states of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, wars in Central Asia and in the Southern Caucasus and the Western Balkans. And until 2014, Ukraine was sort of exempted from this rule, as I would call it, in the post-Yugoslav and post-Soviet space, where only those countries were or mostly only those countries were spared from war that were early on given a membership perspective in the European Union and NATO, or on the other hand, like Belarus and Armenia, went back into the orbit of the former imperial nation. Many of the other countries experienced some sort of instability or war, and you could ask why did it not happen to Ukraine in the 1990s already, or let's say after the Orange Revolution of 2004, or at other points in time. And there was a lot of appetite in Moscow already in the 1990s, long before Putin came to power, for Ukrainian territory. There were declarations of the State Duma first of the Supreme Soviet, then of the State Duma on Crimea, and lots of politicians who had these sort of ideas that Ukraine should not be really separate from Russia. And that leads me to my paper published in Orbis, which is trying to explain the surprising peace phase between in Ukraine, and the peace between Russia and Ukraine until 2014, with interdependence theory, with exactly oddly the same theory that has been at least for the last 60 years or so been a guidance for German foreign policy. I would say even a major idea that was sort of underpinning German foreign policy, namely the idea that we Germans should build economic ties between peoples, especially between our countries and other people, and this would then create peace, because the economic ties would make us dependent on each other, and that would then be good for peace. And the odd thing here was that the very same interdependence theory was actually an excellent explanation for the 20 years of peace that Russia and Ukraine experienced from the breakup of the Soviet Union until 2014, because the countries were interlocked with each other through the Ukrainian gas transportation system that was transporting until late 2012 more than 50% of the Russian gas that was going to the European Union. And therefore, Gazprom, and one could argue in a way the entire Russian economy was dependent on the Ukrainian gas transportation system, because Gazprom, as you may know, is of course subsidizing. It's not paying much taxes to the Russian state, but Gazprom is indirectly subsidizing the entire Russian economy, millions of Russian households, also subsidizing such entities as Transnistria and lots of other projects that the Russian state has. And the source of the money for these subsidies, the major source of this money is are the energy exports, the gas exports to the European Union. And for these exports and for the existence, if you like, of Gazprom and the whole model that Gazprom and the Russian state have developed in the post-Soviet period, the Ukrainian gas transportation system played a crucial role until 2011, 2012, when Nord Stream 1 went into operation. And so the other post-Soviet republics were not as lucky as Ukraine. They did not have this sort of leverage over Russia, and those of these republics that did not have the luxury of getting support from the European Union and NATO early on, like for instance the Baltic republics, they were then soon victims of some sort of Russian mingling and suffered from war, and it became failed states, basically. And here I mean above all Moldova, Georgia, and to some degree one could also apply that to Azerbaijan. So what happened then in 2011, 2012 was that the first Nord Stream pipeline weakened this tie between Russia and Ukraine, and surprise, surprise, in 2013, already under the pro-Russian Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych, the pressure from Russia on Ukraine is increasing. The sort of non-military pressure, the political pressure, the economic pressure is rapidly increasing. So, for instance, in August 2013, we had a almost 1 week full trade blockade between Russia and Ukraine, and then we got eventually the annexation of Crimea starting in late February 2014, and the war in eastern Ukraine. And so the sad story here is about what we're currently observing in Ukraine is that this is nothing new. This is neither in comparative terms something new. This is how former imperial nations, if they are not somehow contained, behave, and that is also not something new for Russia. That is not even something new for Putin's Russia. I mentioned the Moldovan experience that goes back 30 years, and Russia is now only doing basically what it has been already before practicing, and what it has been practicing without being punished. So at least for the case of Ukraine, we had sanctions here, minor sanctions, I would call them, since 2014, individual sanctions, companies were sanctioned. Then in summer 2014, also certain sectors of the Russian economy were sanctioned. In the case of Moldova, we had, as far as I know, never any sanctions. And for Georgia, we had in 2008, I think for 3 months, the negotiations of a new cooperation agreement between the EU and Russia were interrupted. And after that, actually, after the Russian invasion of Georgia and the recognition of Abkhazia and so-called South Ossetia as independent states by Russia and some allies of Russia, we had actually a rapprochement and a warming of relations between the West and Russia. In Germany, we had the so-called Partnership for Modernization, and with regard to the US, we had the reset policy after these de facto, one could argue, annexations of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And one could also add that the sort of the policy of Russia towards Moldova and Georgia was actually until a day ago more aggressive than towards Ukraine. The Moldovan territory occupied by a puppet state of Russia, this Transnistrian republic in eastern Moldova, occupies 12% of the territory of Moldova, and the two pseudo-states on Georgian territory, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, occupy 20% of Georgian territory. Maybe even at the point as we are now speaking, Russia has not occupied actually as much as 20% of the Ukrainian territory. So in a way, you know, it has not yet behaved as bad as towards Ukraine as it did towards Georgia. Also, something I think that sometimes forgotten is that the Russian violation of international law in Moldova for the last 30 years has been actually, even from the Russian point of view, a more strident one than it has been until yesterday, basically, with regard to Ukraine and Georgia, because the so-called operational group of the Russian Federation in Moldova, which is basically which is the rest of the 14th Army in Moldova, which is located near ammunition storage in Transnistria, is actually stationed there against the will of the Moldovan government on territory that Russia still accepts as being official Moldovan territory. So unlike South Ossetia, Abkhazia, the Donetsk Republic, so-called Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic, Russia has never recognized the Transnistrian so-called republic, but it has stationed in Transnistria an officially regular Russian army unit. That is a violation, even from the Russian point of view, that we only see for the last 24 hours with regard to Ukraine. It has not happened actually in this way to Georgia or well, you could argue that it had happened to Georgia in the period when Georgia and when Abkhazia and South Ossetia were not yet recognized, but Russian troops were already there. But it had not yet happened to Ukraine, for instance, where until recently there were only irregular troops in eastern Ukraine stationed officially according to the Russian interpretation, and regular troops were only in Crimea, which officially, according to the Russian point of view, were on Crimea. So we had already all these things happening earlier. They were not punished, they were not sanctioned, and then the sanctions in 2014 were minor. They came too little, too late, and now we have the result of all of this. I just hope that now finally we will get serious sanctions, because the leverage I think that the West has towards Russia is large. The sanctions that have been imposed so far are minor. There is still a lot of trade going on as we speak between Russia and the European Union. A lot of energy is still flowing from Russia into the European Union. As I mentioned, that this is important still for Russia, because it finances Gazprom's subsidizing of the Russian economy and Russian private household. The oil exports are financing the Russian budget, out of which the current military operation is financed. So I hope that we will now finally get our act together and stop this after 30 years of these operations, and contain Russia. We have the instruments to it. I believe we have enough instruments to do that without any sort of military involvement. The Russian economy is a small economy. It's in dollar terms smaller than the Italian economy, and it's deeply integrated into the world economy. It's especially closely linked to the EU economy. The EU is the by far largest foreign investor in Russia. It's still the largest trading partner of Russia. So it's just a matter of political will. And we have now also learned, for instance, in the European Union, that we can live without Russian gas, as Russia was not responding to the gas shortages in the last 3 months. Actually, the European Union has now found ways to export gas from other parts of the world, mainly LNG. So we are actually prepared. We can do that. It will cost us something, but it will be much more costly if this war continues. I think there's too much talk about the sort of nice, good feel issues like solidarity and international law and sympathy and empathy and so on. What we should be talking about is that there are 4 nuclear power plants in Ukraine with 15 active reactors. The largest nuclear power plant of Europe is in Zaporizhia. It's now actually in the war zone with 6 active reactors. That should be something of interest, not only to Ukrainians, but to all Europeans. If the Ukrainian economy collapses and the Ukrainian state collapses, as now becomes possible, and we have no energy, heating, electricity, we get problems with food supplies, then we can get millions of refugees. Ukraine has 40 million citizens. If only a fourth of them get moving, we will have a huge problem in the European Union. And last but not least, this is, of course, and I've written many times about this, this is a huge violation of the entire logic of the non-proliferation regime, the regime for the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Ukraine is an official nuclear weapon state, a non-nuclear weapon state that does not have any nuclear weapons and is forbidden to have any nuclear weapons. Russia is an official nuclear weapon state. It is allowed to have nuclear weapons. And surprise, surprise, Russia is now invading this non-nuclear weapon state. If Ukraine would be a nuclear weapon state, I think we would be in a very different world now. And the biggest absurdity of all of this is, of course, that Ukraine came out as a large nuclear weapon state of the Soviet Union, then agreed to give its nuclear weapons away. It gave it to Russia, got this Budapest memorandum and signed the non-proliferation treaty, which is, unlike the Budapest memorandum, a regular treaty, a fully ratified regular treaty, ratified also by Russia. Russia is actually, as the successor organization of successor state of the Soviet Union, one of the depository states of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, one of the guarantors of the non-proliferation regime, and is now turning the purpose of the non-proliferation regime on its head. And we can await that in the future, there may be politicians that will be learning both from the Ukrainian fate and from the Russian behavior that it's actually very good to have nuclear weapons and to, if you don't want to get your territory invaded, and maybe if you have some appetite for territory in a neighboring country, it's also good to have nuclear weapons and to learn from the Russians how to gain victories. So this is all a national interest of Western states, especially of European states, but also of basically concerning the non-proliferation treaty, I would say, of all countries of the world to uphold the logic of the non-proliferation regime. And therefore, I think we should talk more about these issues than about solidarity, European values, and you know, the humanitarian issues. Thanks.
All right. Well, both of you have given us a lot to digest. Andreas, the last point probably would be a completely another set of panels about, you know, the impact of these events on the whole effort to deproliferate nuclear weapons or prevent states from gaining nuclear capability or encouraging states to give up nuclear capability. And of course, we cannot help but think of the talks currently underway in Vienna with Iran, and of course how these events have potentially an implication for how those talks will continue. I did want to draw back to some themes and then turn to questions, because questions are coming in as well on this. And again, these questions of the ties between what the West is prepared to do, what costs the West is prepared to pay. Andreas, your point about interdependence theory and kind of the assumption that keeping Russian energy flowing through Ukraine was a guarantor of stability. That's certainly something that for many years Maros Sefcovic was arguing in terms of trying to focus the European Union on this. Of course, as far as I know, as of right now, I have not heard otherwise, that even if Ukraine is breaking diplomatic relations with Russia, Energy is still flowing through the pipelines that transit Ukrainian space. But also, even if Nord Stream 2 is suspended, Nord Stream 1, which connects Russia directly with Germany, is still flowing. Turkish Stream is still flowing. So two NATO allies with direct pipeline links to Russia are continuing to do that. The talk about joint action, and yet some reporting this morning about European states looking at second waves of sanctions, and already the discussions about cutouts, or sure, we should sanction Russia, but not this little piece that matters to us. I think it's going to be interesting to see how all of this comes together. And I think Andreas and Val, both kind of a point that you raised is, we've seen this. This has been in some ways a slow motion development. It's not like this suddenly happened yesterday and we're all caught by surprise. And to the extent that the Russians said, look, we've done this a number of times. We've sliced off pieces of states. We've created frozen conflicts, and sooner or later, a status quo emerges that the West learns to live with. But perhaps this has changed. And this actually is a direct lead into our first question from Mark Kustra, who says it seems that Russia is committed to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine and most likely will seek to install its own government. What can and should the other European states and the United States do to prevent this, or at least mitigate this outcome in the long run? And I think, Andreas, this touches on your point that we've seen both in the Yeltsin and Putin and Medvedev years where Russia makes a change and then the West complains, sanctions, and then learns to live with it. But Val, as well, your thoughts about next steps if we have a change of regime in Kiev? What's the approach?
Well, great points that were raised from Andreas too, and a great question too. Let me start, I'll respond to this question, but I'll, pick where Andrea left it also when it comes to the conversations throughout the region. I mean, the narrative that Putin has been creating throughout the region. All this conversation, all this narrative about the new security architecture in Europe. I think, what the Europeans should do should not allow this narrative at all. I mean, and just going from, country to country, then we'll see that, sometimes there's even acceptance of this narrative. Yeah, maybe, we need to sit together and maybe we need to think about a new security architecture. We should be clear and loud and united saying that there is only one aggressive power here, and this is the Kremlin. So it's not the West that has to, go back and see, what did we do wrong? We did not do anything wrong as the West. So this is a very important part of the narrative, because through the various disinformation, campaigns and strategies, it's kind of, people are starting to buy this narrative because they don't want war. And of course they say, well, we could have behaved differently. And that should not be allowed as a narrative to flow. Responding to the question, as I mentioned, having a crony government in Ukraine that does not look West anymore, that's a puppet, of Putin, that has always been his aim. That's why, we saw 2014. But even from the term itself, the revolution of dignity, Ukrainians decided that they wanted to see West. They wanted to look at the West. They wanted to integrate with the West. And I think that is something that it's completely unacceptable for Putin. He cannot even, I don't know if he really understands what that means. So to the point of having a new government that's closer to Russia and to the Kremlin, I am afraid, and maybe I might be completely wrong, because we have seen that we have been wrong over the last few weeks and months too, because nobody was really seeing this coming. We were talking about that, but then we were kind of, behaving in a rational way and think about costs, benefits, and the reality, on the ground. And so it did not make very much sense. But instead, for him, it makes sense for his strategy. So I'm afraid that the Ukrainians will not accept it long term. Ukrainians in Ukraine, young people, but also the large Ukrainian diaspora. So I was just today, here in Amsterdam, there was a protest, and I saw young people on the train, having, the pancards, and I asked them. They were all coming from the East, students here, and they said, like, we just want to go away. We even left Ukraine because we want to be as far away as we can from Russia. And so they know where they want to go. So I'm afraid that in the long term will not be sustainable, because all these actions have created even more that, or will continue to create that national unity and national identity in Ukraine, and the objectives will remain looking on the West. And then, if I might follow up another question, we talked about Georgia, we talked about Moldova. I think we need to bring still Moldova back, as Andreas was discussing. We're focusing on Ukraine now, but we have a democratic government for a long time after many years in Moldova too. So that is still risky. Every successful case study of governance, of democratic governance, is a big risk for Putin. And so we need to pay more attention to what is going to happen in Moldova, where Putin has a very strong leverage, especially when it comes to its energy. 100% of the energy and the plants, the power plants, they're all in Transnistria, are not, in the Transnistrian territory. And then the other country that we need to pay attention is Belarus. So one of the consequences of what we're seeing nowadays will be a de facto unification of Russia and Belarus. So there are talks out there that the Lukashenko is trying to change his constitution to allow weapons, nuclear weapons in his territory. And that will be, of course, Russian nuclear weapons. And that is the long-term challenge for the European capitals, for the European security and the architecture. And here I'm thinking about all the countries in the eastern flank. And so this will not be a challenge just for a few weeks or months. We don't know how long, Putin will be able to stay, because he is attacking, he is trying to invade. But I'm afraid that he'll not be able to maintain any invasion, because we have a different Ukraine, we have a different, different armed forces, much more stronger and developed than back in 2014, and a strong political will, I would say, too, and political will also of the society. So these are things that I think we need to look at. But in terms of a government, I think the people of Ukraine will not support a Russian proxy government. Now, what could be worse is a government that it sells itself as a neutral one, as not close to Russia, but they will kind of, slow down the Euro-Atlantic integration process, or maybe we'll start to move away from the NATO objective, the objective of joining NATO, but still appearing not close to Russia, but as a neutral government that is trying to bring peace to the country. I think that will be the riskiest thing for Ukraine going forward. What should the West do was part of the question too. I think, sanctions, we mentioned that, but strong sanctions, as Andreas mentioned, Russian economy is strongly interrelated with the European economy. So sanctions will work in this case. More weapons to Ukraine to defend the armed forces of Ukraine, to defend itself and its territory. Financial assistance is very much needed. Ukraine today is the poorest country in Europe. It has been for a few years now. Humanitarian assistance, which is very much needed. So I think this is what the West should unite and come into actions quickly, soon.
Yeah. Before I go to you, Andreas, just Val, your last points there also seem to touch on the question that Charles Burhan had posed about, although he does raise the question of German reluctance on this, about the military side, that is providing weapons, providing the training without necessarily getting involved. And I know, Andreas, you also noted that even without thinking about a military to military response, the West really hasn't unleashed the full impact of its financial and economic power. As you've said before, that the sanctions have been relatively minor. And I think that you saw this in sort of Russian boasts about being able to survive sanctions. Well, because in a way we never imposed the full weight of what we could. But don't want to go ahead and your answers to any comments as Val has provided them.
Yeah, first of all, about a sort of new regime, new government. I've lived in Ukraine now for 20 years. I cannot imagine how this would emerge, even a neutral government, because you would have to have some procedure to determine who would that be. There couldn't be a government that, where Putin just said, this is the government I like, and then, there would be no acceptance for that. And if you have then elections, even a neutral sort of party would probably have problems getting votes, and so the only thing that would be possible would be some sort of occupation regime with a fairly terroristic occupation regime that would basically replace most of the current elite, and then perhaps put in some Quisling. But then this would have to be. This would have to be based on terror. This wouldn't be some sort of accepted regime. The Ukrainian political tradition is just very different. The Ukrainians kicked out their first president already in 1994, when they kicked out Leonid Kravchuk and put in Leonid Kuchma. So there's no, this is not like in other regions of the world, maybe, where you could sort of frame some sort of government and then have some sort of pseudo procedure to legitimize it, and then people will somehow accept it. That's not possible in Ukraine. Yeah. I fully agree with what Walbona said, and as I see it, the problem that we still have in countries like Germany, and I guess in other, especially continental European countries, that the whole debate is between morality on the one side and our sympathy for Ukraine and for maybe also for Georgia, Moldova, and empathy and humanitarian issues, and will send help and so on. And then we have the interests on the other side, the economic interests, the larger geopolitical interests, sort of the national interests of the parties, and so on. And then at the end of the day, Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia are not members of the EU. They're not members of NATO, so we cannot do about this. And this is actually now, becoming, as I indicated, it's becoming very problematic because, if you have a few 100,000 refugees from Ukraine, maybe the EU can handle that. But if you then, if then the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth million comes, then simply the question is, who will take them? Where will they, be located? Who will feed them? And these are not all IT experts that would be coming. These would be, not immigrants, labor migrants, but refugees. They need then to be put somewhere if they cannot live anymore, and there's no physical border. And I cannot imagine, what would happen on the, let's say, the Ukrainian-Polish border if you then have these large refugee streams. Will we then put their wall, or would we then shoot at the refugees? Or so there's no solution to that, and neither the EU nor NATO can actually provide a solution for that. The same goes with, God forbid, something happens to these 15 nuclear reactors in Ukraine. The problem here is not so much that they will be hit by grenades, but they need a certain personnel and infrastructure to function properly. And Ukraine needs these nuclear power plants because otherwise there's not enough electricity in the country. So there's no real choice, and they have to work well, and they have they need all the engineers being there, all the the equipment working, and so on. And how do you do that in a war situation, especially Zaporizhia, where the largest nuclear power plant of Europe is located, not just of Ukraine. And then, you know, what is NATO and what are the EU going to do with that? You know, these are not organizations that can deal somehow with. So we have to get to a discussion about national interests of West European countries, you know, and once this starts, maybe then there is a chance actually to become finally serious and not talk anymore about development and help and solidarity and European values and all of this. We need to get down to the real issues, to national interests.
Yeah. That actually, to close out as a last question, both of you have been talking about the question of refugees and migration, and Ryan Dow had posed the question of whether or not sparking refugee flows is part of Putin's strategy of seeing that large movement of large numbers of people into Europe it could strengthen authoritarian populist movements. It can be used as an issue. It becomes part of the why are these people here? This fight is not our fight, and you know, we should you know, find some sort of accommodation with Russia. We have obviously elections in Hungary coming up, where the fate of Viktor Orban, whether or not he'll be reelected. We have the elections in France and elsewhere. So maybe to close out, do you see you know, are these unintended consequences perhaps, or are they intended consequences? That is, that this is one of the fracture points of transatlantic, or certainly European unity, is to say, well, we'll use the flows of people as a way to create issues. So any thoughts you have on that, and then final thoughts you'd like to leave us with in the 5 minutes or so, or less than 5 minutes we have left?
So maybe, Nika, I'll take that question. I'd like to thank Ryan for a great question. I think that is an intended consequence of the strategy of divide and conquer in Europe. Unfortunately, not just now, but over the last decade, we have noticed in Europe a regionalization, if I might call it like that, of security threats. So we already knew that countries in the Eastern Flank would see Russia as the main security challenge, but that was not the case for countries such as Italy or Spain, or countries in the South that suffered more the migration crisis in 2015, 2016, but even before that. So we had this regionalization of security threats. I believe, and I think, you know, we have an example with what happened with Belarus just a couple of months ago, that migrants were used as a tool of, you know, a hybrid war. Why not call them like that? And although in this case, the European Union responded with the right approach, defending, you know, the EU countries from these hybrid attacks, because migrants were used in this case. But I think in the case of Ukraine, we're talking about a country of 42 million inhabitants. So if attacks will continue, we will of course see massive migration flows into European countries. And perhaps at the very beginning, I agree with Andreas, it will be felt that we have, you know, to be in solidarity with the, you know, with people there, or with people coming in, but that in the long term, that will change political dynamics and elections in Europe. And we will definitely see a rise of populism like we saw in 2015, 2016. So, I mean, I think the history repeats itself. And Putin, if we want to be fair, is not that smart, because he's using the same playbook over and over again. I think it's the West that's not, you know, it's understanding it, but it's not going back with the, you know, the necessary, with the appropriate approaches. And of course, countries will have their own interests, economic interests too. We should not forget that we have a devastating still economic situation throughout Europe because of the COVID crisis. So if you add more to that, that is going to definitely, you know, change the political dynamics in the in the national politics of European Union countries. And just one final point about the European Union, since I mean very strong messages from Ms. von der Leyen too on European unity and sanctions, so all very important. But before the sanctions, what we have seen, we have seen more kind of bilateral talks. France, with Russia, Germany with Russia. We have not seen that strong EU response. So at the end of the day, it goes into the most important countries of European Union to have a strong voice. And if I would have to close on on an optimistic and positive note, if there is any optimism or if there is anything positive in this devastating situation, which it's hard to find, is that the response of the Germany has been a tough one, and one that many will not even expect, going from the first speech as taking the second round as president of Germany, of President Steinmeier, where he was very open regarding the security risks and the aggressiveness of Russia for the European security. He said that it's very clear there's only one aggressive power in Europe, and that is Russia, with the behavior recently. And then what we have seen from Chancellor Scholz or the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So we have had very strong, strict signals and strong narrative coming from the German government. So hopefully we'll see more European unity in the future. And I will like to close it with what I started, that I think our unity is the best deterrence. Putin is just trying us. If we're not strong enough now in Ukraine, it will be the Baltics next. It will be, other countries. We should not forget the Western Balkans. With what is happening in Ukraine right now, the risk is very high with Bosnia and Herzegovina, with relations between Kosovo and Serbia. So these are all regions that are not stable yet. And just one final reminder regarding European security. We talk a lot about defense budgets and how the United States covers always between the 70 and 80% of NATO's budget, and how EU NATO countries need to increase their share in the budgets. The closer to the parity, the budget was back in the late 90s when we had the war in the Balkans. So that is what we had, to think beforehand in terms of increasing defense spending, and the Europeans having more responsibility, not autonomy, because NATO, what has happened, has made it clear that NATO is the main security umbrella of the European Union. But we're talking about some more responsibility of EU member states of NATO that can serve as first responders, in this case, in the European soil. Thank you.
Thank you. Andreas, final thoughts?
Yeah, going back to the topic of my paper for Orbis here, I think now the country I think that I would see has to be most asked about from is Germany. Germany has a special relationship with Russia. Germany has not yet been delivering any weapons to Ukraine, although Ukraine has requested that. Although Germany is one of the largest weapons exporters in the world. So I don't think the German weapons are necessary in Ukraine, but what is necessary from Germany now is to ensure that the European Union takes strong steps and that we will actually see now action after the all good words. I agree with Valbona that we have seen now a surprising turnaround, or not that surprising, but finally we have seen a turnaround of many of the politicians who were talking differently. The Social Democrats basically have now fully come around. Even the left party now is rather critical of Putin, and even the far right, the Alternative for Germany, has now criticized the recent escalation. That is now something good that has happened in Germany, but I'm still waiting for action, so to say. And there was too much talk already in the past. too much diplomacy, too much nice words, and now we need Germany to use its influence and its economic power to finally create peace in Eastern Europe.
Well, I think that's a perfect thing to wrap it up on. A lot of statements. We need to see what the action is. I'd like to thank you both for taking the time to be with us today. I'd like to thank our audience, and just to remind the audience that programs like this that the Foreign Policy Research Institute does comes as the result of generosity of sponsors and patrons. And we certainly encourage you to all to consider joining FPRI and being part of the team that helps bring this type of analysis to a larger world. But with that, again, Dr. Zanelli, Dr. Umland, thank you very much for taking the time today and for offering these thoughts and comments.